Karen continued to give her support to each of the men, but she was now feeling ill, and her doctor advised her to rest. Being a determined woman, she, of course, refused any such advice. Her family were also advising her to rest and look after her health. Although her daughters particularly were concerned about their mother, she flatly refused to do anything different. She continued to paint her watercolors, as this was, in her family's eyes, her only passion and her relaxation. The family had objected to John's presence in her apartment. He had started going to her whenever he had the chance. Karen was considerate and understanding, but her family were not. They did not see why their mother should have to tolerate his behavior. When they were there, he was aggressive, even insulting. He had now lost much of his ability to get along with people. Karen's family didn't understand his illness, and more importantly, didn't understand why their mother should have to put up with it. Karen was also beginning to doubt her strength and her ability to put up with John. She still liked him. He still made her laugh, but his increasingly bizarre behavior was becoming difficult to tolerate. Thankfully, by this time, Sylvie, the mad dentist, as everyone was now calling her, had left the area. She had been offered another position as a dentist in another part of Belgium. She had left, sold her apartment, and was not to be seen again. Her damage had been done. John had become dependent on painkillers. He had persuaded one of the local doctors that he should be provided with a supply of these drugs so that he could inject himself. Another doctor he had persuaded to give him a supply of antidepressants, as many as he needed when he needed them. It appeared to Max that the doctors were prepared to prescribe anything, as long as it kept John happy and away from their surgeries. John was very good at manipulating people, especially people that he wanted or needed something from. He could be charming, normal, chatty, and very convincing. This took its toll on him, though. Max had been with him to the local social services department in the town, and although he knew the truth, John was able to act completely normal. He could do this quite successfully when it was needed. What these people didn't see was his behavior when he got back home. John would be exhausted. Being normal was something he could do, but it came with a cost. He could maintain his normality for an hour or so, but afterwards he would have to go to bed and could sleep for an hour or so. This was the life that he was leading, and it was the life that Max would now have to accept if he was going to keep his promise. Kurt had found somewhere else to live in another part of the country, and was sure that he would no longer be living in Moselstraat. Kurt was not bitter or angry about this. He simply accepted that he could no longer live like this. He himself was taking strong antidepressants, and although he still loved John, and he deeply loved John, he could no longer live like this. He had become a stranger in his own house. For Max, he was also struggling with this strange behavior. John dominated everything. He was there, he was always there, and everything in life had to revolve around what he wanted and what he said. It was not that Max was in some way intimidated. That was not the reason why he stayed. He could see that this was all due to John's illness. The problem was, as he explained later to a friend, if John had a physical disability, there would be doctors and nurses there to help. If he was in a wheelchair, he would be helped with his life and his mobility. Physical disability was there to be seen by everyone, and so there was help. If he had been traditionally mentally ill, if he had depression or psychosis, then there were psychiatrists and health workers who would be there to help, to give support, to make sure that he had the best care. John had none of this. He had brain damage and demons that were difficult to see. He had a silent, unseen illness that affected him as much as any physical or mental illness had. But for John, there was no help, no understanding. He was on his own, trying to make a life for himself without any medical help or support, any real medical help or support that understood his condition. Max understood this, and that's why he stayed, why he didn't leave, why he was there to help John. It wasn't John's fault. He was just trying to live a life. What people didn't realize was that the doctors had removed a part of his brain, an important part of his brain, and the consequences were there for Max to see. No one else could see it. Max could. Karen could. Perhaps even Kurt could. But no one else could. Max was on his own to help and support his friend, while the rest of the world moved away, ignored him, and deserted him. Max had made a promise, and he was not about to break that promise. John was very much on his own now. Moselstraat continued as it had before, but visitors were now few and far between. Kurt was more and more distant, so it was really only John, Max, and Wotan. The house was quiet now. John's new girlfriend, Sylvie, who had now left her job and was away from Tavern, she had dropped John as quickly as she'd picked him up. She was nowhere to be seen now. She'd gone. Max suspected that Karen had talked to her and told her to leave him alone. Karen was no fool. She understood what was going on and seriously did not approve of the relationship. Max felt the same about this woman. There was no jealousy there for him, only an underlying concern about how she had been treating him, how she had been treating John. She was using him for her amusement, and considering that all they had gone through, a grown woman such as this one should have known better. Thankfully, she was now gone without leaving John a contact number. A few weeks passed in general quiet life, and they tried to make their way back into their lives, although it became obvious to everyone who knew him that John would never be able to hold down a full-time job. He couldn't do it. He couldn't take the stress or the constant pressure on him to perform. Perhaps he could find a part-time job or something that would put pressure on him, but work was always difficult to find, and John showed no enthusiasm to try and find something. One day Kurt came back with bad news. Karen had been taken urgently into hospital. One of her daughters had phoned him at work and told him that she was in a bad way. It was her heart, and the doctors were very worried about her. She had been repeatedly warned that she would take life easy. She should be careful and look after her health. But Karen, being Karen, she had ignored all this advice. She was a determined woman, was prepared to take the chance and enjoy life. Now, it appeared, her lifestyle had caught up with her and her heart had given way. Thankfully, she was being well looked after, but the outlook was not good. Kurt had arranged to go and visit her that evening, although her family would be there. At Moselstraat, both John and Max were suitably worried. Karen had always been strong. She was the kind of woman who would go on living forever. After all, her mother, now in her 90s, was still living a full and active life in Germany. Max had met this woman once when she was visiting her family in Belgium and been surprised how young she appeared considering her age. She had always thought that Karen would follow her mother. She would live forever. Now she was in a hospital and her life was hanging in the balance. For Max, this was a blow. He had grown to rely on Karen and her advice. She had always been the person he could go to for someone to talk to. They were friends, good friends. They spent many hours talking about a wide range of things, usually about what was happening with John and Kurt, but they had other interests. Max had even used his computer skills to create a website for her paintings. She had a wide collection of paintings that she had hung around her apartment. There was a collection of paintings in the spare bedroom that she could not find a place to hang. She had exhibited them locally, and they were so good, in Max's opinion. But they should have been shown to a wider audience. So he created a website and scanned a collection of her best paintings so that he could upload to the internet. He was pleased with the results. So was Karen. It had even attracted attention from an art gallery in New York, who said that they might be interested in exhibiting her paintings in the center of New York. Karen had just laughed at this. She was not traveling all the way to America to show her paintings. Had this happened when she was younger, perhaps she would have considered it, but not now. Anyway, she spent a large part of her life traveling the world with her ex-husband and had seen New York. Now she was just happy to stay at home with her family and friends and paint. Now she was ill, and Max missed her already. It was only a few days later, after Karen had been urgently taken into hospital, that King came back with the news that she'd died. There was nothing more that the hospital or the doctors could do for her. Her heart was too bad, and it had finally failed. Her family had turned off her life support machine and let her go. Max was shocked. They were all shocked, and it took some time for the news to sink in. The family had asked Kurt to help with the funeral, and he would be busy with the organization for the next few days. Kurt told Max, when they were alone, that the family had banned John from attending the funeral. They did not want him there. Her daughter blamed John for putting too much stress on her mother, and in a way blamed him for her mother's death. Max was also not invited, but the family had said that they don't blame him in the same way that they blame John, and that he could go if he wanted to. He would have to go on his own, though. Kurt was invited as a close friend of the family. Max realized that he couldn't go under these conditions. He couldn't go without John. Their accusation was unfair, and he felt that he couldn't tell John that he and Kurt were going. But he, John, wasn't allowed to. So Max decided to stay at home on the day and not saying anything to John. He just said that it was better if Kurt went on his own to represent the three of them. He made the excuse that the family wanted a small, intimate funeral with only family and close friends invited. Max felt disappointed about this attitude. But he wasn't family, only a friend, so the final decision must be her daughter's. He had no doubt, though, if the decision had been left to Karen herself, then he would have been invited. He would have been there. They had been close, but she wasn't there anymore, so he had to accept the decision. The one thing that did surprise Max was that he received a phone call from Kurt. They needed a photo of Karen to use on her funeral card. It was a tradition in Belgium for the family to send out a remembrance card for friends and neighbours. Karen had many friends, and so the family had arranged for a local printer to make the cards ready for the funeral. Max had a photo he had taken of Karen for her website. Luckily, he still had a copy of it on his hard drive. It was really a nice photograph of her. He had taken it a few months ago, and to make sure that he showed it in her best light, he had used his skills with Photoshop. He had softened the light, erased a few of her wrinkles, highlighted her blonde hair, and generally made her look good. It was not that Karen had looked old, but there was something wrong in not flattering a woman. Why not? He had used a gentle touch on the photo, and the real Karen was still there. It was just a few of life's ravages that had been washed away. Max had been proud of his efforts. It was this photo that Max sent through to Kurt at the printers. He was happy to help and was pleased that Kurt had turned to him to help with this difficult time. The photo was ideal for the remembrance card, and the printer used it on the front. Kurt never told the family where the photo had come from. When Max received a copy of the card, there was a photo of Karen on the front. His photo. The printer had done a good job of reproducing it. Max was proud of it. He knew that Karen had liked it, and if this was the last image of her that people remembered, then he had done his job. It was his last gift to Karen. In the days that followed, Max had seen the card displayed in local shops and cafes. People had even commented on it. As often in such cases, families had to rely on some old photo of the deceased or an inappropriate selfie photo taken on holiday. Few people had an image of such quality to be used as their final image. There, Karen, he thought to himself as he looked at the card displayed in his local bar. There's my gift to you, my darling. Rest in peace. He smiled to himself, and something in the back of his mind could feel Karen smiling back at him. He would miss her. A week after the funeral, Karen's family were clearing out of her apartment. They'd found a large collection of CDs that were mainly of classical music and opera. They were not sure what to do with them, so Kurt offered to take them back home to Merselstraat. There were boxes of them which were loaded into the car. The paintings had to go to different members of the family. There was also a collection of books which Kurt also offered to remove and find some way of disposing of them. There were a few other things that the family didn't want or had no use for, so Kurt also offered to take care of it all. When he arrived back at the house, the car was full of things from Karen's apartment. John immediately descended on the CDs and started working through them. He was like a child at Christmas, so even if the family had not wanted him near them, he did at least have a souvenir from Karen. It was her collection of music. That made up for any insult or rejection he had felt about not going to the funeral. Kurt had found a few things that he could use. Max also found one or two things, but there wasn't much left. He would have liked one of her paintings, but the family had taken all of those. One strange thing, though, did happen. Perhaps not strange, but it did make him smile. He was looking through some of her books, and one book fell on the floor. As he picked it up, a piece of paper fell out from inside and lay face down on the floor. He picked it up and turned it over. It was a watercolor signed by Karen. It was only small, the size of a greeting card, but it was one of her paintings. It was a picture of the lake near Tavern. Her style was recognizable, and although it was small, it was definitely one of her works. Perhaps she had done it casually one day when she didn't want to paint a full picture. But like any artist, couldn't resist taking a notebook out and just sitting there painting the lake. Max looked at it. It had been hidden in a book. The family hadn't seen it, only him. As he looked at it, he thought of Karen again. Here was her gift to him. It was at the same time that Kurt announced that he was moving out of Merselstraat. His brother had found him a place to live close to his family, and that was the end. He would pack his belongings and move out. John said nothing. He just stood there quietly trying to understand what was happening. For Max, it didn't come as a surprise. Perhaps it was Karen's death that had been the final push for Kurt. Either way, it was the end of an era.